the last of her kind. The night was still. A soft, unearthly hum filled the air as an object streaked across the dark sky. At first, it was a blur, just a flash of light in the distance. But as it grew closer, the distinct shape of a spaceship became visible. Its once sleek, silver surface was now marred by fire and smoke. The ship faltered, as if struggling to stay in the air. It was clear that this was no ordinary craft. This was something far more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. With a deafening crash, the ship plummeted into a secluded stretch of wilderness just outside a small town. Trees snapped under the weight, and dust and debris shot up into the air. The noise was almost too much for the silence of the forest, sending birds flying in every direction. But there was no time for panic. There was only the eerie quiet that followed the wreck. Somewhere deep in the woods, a man named Ethan stood frozen. His senses told him something was wrong, deeply wrong. He'd been walking the trails just before dusk, a routine he always followed. But now, the air felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't understand. His heart began to race as the distant rumble echoed through the trees. Something had crashed. Something big. Without a second thought, he turned and began running toward the sound, his curiosity outweighing any sense of fear. His mind raced. Was it a plane? No, it couldn't be. A plane would have made a different sound, would have been louder. What was it then? The crash had been too sudden, too violent. Ethan's footsteps grew quicker, his breath becoming heavier as he pressed on. The forest began to thin, and he emerged into a small clearing. His eyes widened at the sight before him. There in the center of the clearing lay the wreckage of a spacecraft. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, with smooth metallic surfaces that gleamed even in the dim moonlight. The ship was mangled, half buried in the earth, its wings torn apart by the impact. Smoke billowed from the damaged engine, but there was no sign of fire. There was only the silence, a heavy, ominous silence. But then, just as Ethan took a step closer, he heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind and the crackling of the wreckage. A low guttural hum. He froze in his tracks. The sound came from inside the wreck, from somewhere deep within the ship. It was almost alive. His heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what was going on, but something inside him urged him forward, pulling him to investigate further. He cautiously approached the ship, his hand trembling as he touched the cold, metallic surface. It was warm, almost alive with energy. As he placed his hand on it, the hum grew louder. It was like a heartbeat, steady and rhythmic, as if something, or someone, was still inside. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and leave, but curiosity won. He crouched down, peering into the cracked hull, trying to make out any shapes in the dim light. Then he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. But no, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the ship, he saw the figure. She was tall, her skin a pale shade of blue, almost translucent in the shadows. Her features were sharp, almost otherworldly, with eyes that glowed softly like twin moons. She was laying on her back, surrounded by scattered metal pieces, a faint breath rising and falling in her chest. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like her. Her body was delicate, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she lay, as if she could rise at any moment. He could feel an inexplicable pull, as though the sight of her had an effect on his very soul. It was as if she wasn't just another life form, but something far more significant. His heart pounded in his chest, unsure of what he was witnessing. The alien stirred, her eyes flicking open slowly. They weren't like human eyes, but instead a shimmering golden hue that seemed to pierce through the darkness. For a long moment she stared at him, as if assessing his every move, his every breath. There was a strange intensity in her gaze, one that made Ethan feel as though she could see into his very soul. She blinked slowly, the corners of her mouth twitching as if attempting a smile. And then, without a sound, she lifted her hand toward him. Ethan felt an intense rush of energy, like a bolt of lightning shot through his veins. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from her as possible. But his feet felt rooted to the spot, as though some invisible force was holding him in place. He should have been terrified, but for some reason he wasn't. The fear he expected to feel was absent, replaced instead by an overwhelming sense of awe and curiosity. She reached out with her slender fingers, and Ethan felt his pulse race. His body trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, something he couldn't explain. Was it a warning? A bond? Was he supposed to help her? The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, both of them locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Then her eyes narrowed, and she spoke, a strange, melodic language that Ethan couldn't understand. Yet, somehow, he felt he understood everything. The alien was the last of her kind, and she had come to Earth seeking something, or someone. Ethan's mind spun with questions, but only one thing echoed in his head. She was the key. The key to something far greater than either of them could comprehend. And that was just the beginning. First encounter. Ethan stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the alien. Her golden eyes seemed to pierce through him, as if she could read every hidden thought in his mind. There was no fear, no panic, just an unexplainable connection that tethered him to her in that moment. He had to move, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if some invisible force held him there, just beyond the point of comfort. The alien's slender fingers, still outstretched, hovered in the air for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand to the ground. Her eyes never left him. She blinked, and in the silence of the forest, the air seemed to thicken, the world around them holding its breath. Ethan's heartbeat echoed in his ears. He had no idea what to do. This wasn't a dream. He knew that much. And yet, it felt like one. The kind of dream that you couldn't wake up from. One where the reality of the situation slowly crawled over you, making everything feel surreal. The alien's mouth moved, and a soft, melodic sound escaped her lips. The language was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was beautiful, almost like a song. But the words, they meant nothing to him. She spoke again, this time with a little more urgency, but Ethan only stared, his mind racing to process the impossible. In a flash, she pushed herself up onto her knees, and Ethan instinctively stepped back, a mix of awe and caution rising within him. The alien didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. Her body moved with an elegance he couldn't quite place, almost inhuman. She seemed to shimmer as if the air itself could barely contain her. Despite the eerie stillness around them, something deep inside Ethan urged him forward, pulled him toward her like a magnet. He took a slow, cautious step closer. His eyes never left hers, as if locked in some kind of silent agreement. Every instinct told him to run, to get away, but he couldn't. He was drawn to her, as if fate had woven their paths together in ways that made no sense. When their gazes met once more, the alien's expression softened, her features shifting slightly, as though confused or uncertain. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her confusion mirrored his own. They were both strangers in this moment. Yet there was a bond forming between them. Something powerful, something undeniable. "Who are you?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, trembling as the question left his lips. He barely recognized his own voice, as if it was being pulled from him by forces beyond his control. The alien's lips parted again, and she repeated the same musical sounds, this time a little slower. She then reached out, her hand hovering near Ethan's chest. She didn't touch him, but the space between them seemed to hum with energy, an electric charge that filled the air. Ethan could feel it now, a strange warmth spreading through his body, the kind of warmth that didn't come from the air or the forest around them. It came from her. Despite the language barrier, Ethan could feel the alien's intent. Her gaze softened, and somehow, in that moment, he understood her better than he understood himself. She wasn't just another being from another world. She was lost. She had survived something catastrophic, something devastating. And now, she was alone, the last of her kind. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. The weight of that realization sank deep into his bones. He had never thought about life beyond Earth, never truly believed that there could be anything or anyone out there in the vastness of space. And now, standing before him, was proof, undeniable proof, that Earth was no longer alone. The silence between them stretched, and then, without warning, the alien stood up. Her movements were graceful, yet swift, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. She didn't seem injured, though her ship had crashed hard. There was something otherworldly about the way she moved. Her eyes met his again, and this time they were filled with something new, determination. Ethan blinked. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The alien tilted her head, and for the briefest moment, her golden eyes darkened. It was almost as if she had to think before answering. Then her hand shot out once again, this time reaching for Ethan's arm. He flinched slightly, but she didn't seem to notice. Instead, she gently pulled him toward her with surprising strength. The world seemed to tilt around him. His mind screamed for him to pull back, to question everything, but his body betrayed him. He took a step forward, then another. There was a strange pull, like an invisible thread connecting them, and he couldn't resist. The alien's grip was gentle, but there was no doubt. She was in control. With a soft click, a device on her wrist lit up. The strange markings on it glowed a soft blue, pulsating in rhythm with the beat of her heart. It was almost hypnotic. Ethan stared at the device, mesmerized by the light. Suddenly, the air shifted. The forest, the trees, the ground beneath his feet, all of it seemed to fade away, as though he were no longer standing on Earth at all. His vision blurred, and for a split second, he felt as if he were no longer in his body. His thoughts became clouded, and the world around him warped into a dizzying, otherworldly swirl of colors and sounds. Ethan stumbled, his hands reaching out for something solid. The alien's grip tightened, steadying him. He blinked and the world returned to its normal state. The trees, the dark sky, the remnants of the wreckage, they were all still there. But something had changed. He could feel it. The pull, the connection, it was stronger now. The alien stared at him, and Ethan had no idea what she wanted. Was she trying to communicate? Was she trying to tell him something important? Or was she simply lost, like the last star in the sky, fading with no way to return home? One thing was certain, this encounter was far from over. And now, neither of them could escape what was about to unfold. Unseen forces. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the events that had unfolded in the last few minutes. The alien, who had only moments ago seemed distant and mysterious, was now standing right in front of him, her golden eyes locked onto his, with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. There was no mistaking it. There was something about her, something that he couldn't explain, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As she held his arm gently but firmly, he could feel the faint hum of energy in the air around them. It wasn't like anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just the electrical charge of the forest after a thunderstorm. It was something deeper, something ancient. Her presence alone seemed to bend the very space around them, as if the air itself was charged with her power. The alien didn't speak again. Her silence, however, was just as powerful as any words she might have said. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking, what she wanted from him. Her eyes seemed to be reading him, not just with her gaze, but with some other invisible sense that transcended language. It was as though she could see right into his soul, laying bare all his... Ethan followed her gaze to the remains of the ship. The wreckage was smoking, the twisted metal gleaming under the pale moonlight, but there was no immediate sign of fire. Yet something in the air felt wrong. He glanced back at the alien. only to find her looking at him with a mixture of warning and urgency. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it too. A presence, something watching them from the shadows. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet vibrated, faint at first, then growing stronger with each passing second. The trees rustled as if shaken by an unseen force, and the air itself seemed to shimmer. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the sensation of being watched intensified. Something was out there, something beyond the wreckage, something ancient, malevolent. The alien's eyes darted toward the edge of the clearing, her body tense, poised to react at any moment. Ethan followed her gaze, his instincts screaming at him to run, to escape. But his feet felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense that something was about to happen. The vibrations intensified, and suddenly, from the darkness beyond the trees, there was a low, guttural growl. It was unmistakable. The sound of something large, something dangerous, moving closer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the growl was followed by the unmistakable crunch of branches snapping. His mind raced to comprehend what was happening. What kind of creature could make such a sound? And more importantly, what did it want? The alien turned toward him, her golden eyes filled with something akin to fear. For the first time since they had met, she seemed vulnerable. The wall of invulnerability that had surrounded her began to crumble, revealing something far more human, or perhaps something far more alien. Without a word, she moved quickly, her body gliding effortlessly through the shadows, her eyes scanning the trees. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched her, caught between his desire to follow and the growing instinct to flee. But before he could make a decision, the alien turned toward him, her expression firm. She didn't have to speak. He understood. "Stay close," she communicated, her eyes locking onto his. There was no room for hesitation, no room for questioning. He had to stay with her. Suddenly, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, its body humanoid but far more monstrous. Its skin was a deep, mottled green, and its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in claws that scraped the ground with each step. The creature's eyes glowed a sickly yellow, its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The alien didn't flinch. She moved quickly, placing herself between the creature and him, her body a shield. The creature growled again, low and threatening, and Ethan felt the air grow heavy with danger. He could see it now. This wasn't just any creature. It was something sentient, something intelligent. And it was here for one reason. Her, the last of her kind. The alien's eyes flared with a sudden intensity, a wave of energy rippling from her as she raised her arm. Ethan felt the power surge through the air, like a sudden gust of wind that knocked him back. The creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it stepped back, clearly wary of the alien's power. Ethan's mind raced. What was going on? Who was this creature? And why did it seem so focused on the alien? He had so many questions, but there was no time to ask. The tension in the air was unbearable. The alien's gaze softened as she turned toward him. "Run," she whispered in her strange, melodic language. But this time, Ethan didn't need to understand the words. The urgency in her voice said it all. And in that moment, he realized the truth. She wasn't just the last of her kind. She was being hunted. And if he didn't act fast, he might be the next target. The obsession deepens. The creature's growl echoed through the forest. But it wasn't the only sound in the air anymore. Ethan's breath was coming in rapid gasps, and the alien's every movement sent waves of energy through the clearing. He could feel the strange force pulsing around her, like an invisible shield that had sprung into place to protect them both. She stood tall, poised to strike, yet there was an air of calm in her demeanor. She was in control, at least for now. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. His eyes flicked from the creature to the alien, trying to make sense of the situation. The way the alien had moved to shield him, the way her presence seemed to demand attention. It was becoming clearer that she wasn't just another being from another world. She had a power, a force of will that was unlike anything he had ever encountered. And yet, as she stood before him, facing the monstrous creature, Ethan felt something else in her gaze, something that went beyond her role as protector. Her golden eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, he saw something raw, something vulnerable, an emotion that she wasn't trying to hide. It wasn't fear, exactly, but there was something there. A deep, unspoken connection that had grown between them, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. The creature took another step forward, its claws scraping the earth beneath it. The alien didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her arm, the device on her wrist glowing with a steady light. A sudden, blinding pulse of energy shot out from her, striking the creature and sending it reeling backward, stumbling. It screeched in pain, a sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine before it regained its footing and growled once more. But the alien wasn't finished. With a fluid motion, she moved closer to the creature, her every step confident, graceful, and deliberate. It was clear to Ethan now. She wasn't just defending herself. She wasn't just protecting him. She was hunting this creature, just as much as it was hunting her. The creature lunged, but before it could close the distance, the alien raised her hand, a wave of energy surging from her fingertips. The creature howled in agony as the energy wrapped around it, pinning it in place. It struggled, its claws scraping uselessly against the force that held it. The alien's gaze remained fixed on it, unflinching. She had absolute control over the situation. Ethan stood back, his mind racing. He had never seen anything like this. The alien was powerful, far more than he could have ever imagined. But what was more disturbing was the way she seemed to revel in it. There was an intensity in her eyes, a focus that bordered on obsession. It was as though she was drawn to this fight, as if this creature, and perhaps the danger it represented, was somehow tethered to her survival. Why? Ethan found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. Why does it want you? The alien paused for a moment, her eyes flicking toward him, and then back to the creature. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Her expression spoke volumes. There was something more going on here, something deeper. The creature wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to everything she had left. But it was also something more. Ethan could sense it. The way she reacted to it, the way she fought. It wasn't just survival. It was personal. There was a burning need, an obsession that had taken root in her heart, one that extended far beyond the moment. She had to defeat it. She had to prove something, not just to the creature, but to herself. The alien's energy pulsed again, stronger this time, as she closed the gap between herself and the creature. With a swift motion, she thrust her hand forward, and the creature let out a final scream before it was engulfed in a burst of light. It disappeared in an instant, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the ground. The clearing was still again, save for the lingering echoes of the creature's cries. Ethan's heart was still racing, but he couldn't look away from her. The alien stood, her chest heaving with the effort of the battle, but her gaze never wavered. It wasn't just the creature that had been defeated. It was something inside of her, something he couldn't quite place. Her obsession, her need for something more, had driven her to this point. She turned slowly toward Ethan, her eyes still glowing. But now there was something else, a new kind of intensity. Her breathing slowed, and she took a step closer, almost too close. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had thought he was prepared for whatever came next, but now, with the creature gone and the danger past, the reality of their connection hit him full force. The alien's voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but there was a weight to her words that carried a deeper meaning. "I am the last of my kind," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of the battle that had just unfolded. "I must survive. I must rebuild. But I cannot do it alone." Ethan blinked, confusion and curiosity flooding him. "What do you mean? What do you need me for?" Her golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt almost overwhelming. "I need you," she said simply, and her words struck Ethan like a physical blow. You are part of something greater than you realize, something that can... The alien's obsession with him wasn't just about protection. It was something deeper, something more primal. She needed him, and the strange, inexplicable bond between them had only just begun to reveal its true nature. Ethan had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain: his life had changed forever. Danger lurks. Ethan's mind was still reeling from the alien's words. I need you. It echoed in his mind over and over again. But for all the weight those words carried, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this. Something deeper. The alien, standing so close to him, had revealed more than just a need for survival. She was driven by something stronger, something more dangerous. It wasn't just about rebuilding. It was about a bond, one that could change everything. But as the alien turned to face the wreckage, her eyes narrowing, a wave of tension swept over him. Her gaze was no longer filled with the calm focus he had seen moments before. Now, there was an edge to it, a sense of urgency. Her hand moved to the device on her wrist, its soft glow pulsing steadily as she activated it once again. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the silence stretched between them. It felt like something was coming, something that would change everything they thought they knew. What's happening? Ethan asked, his voice tight, his instincts screaming that the worst was yet to come. The alien didn't respond immediately. She was scanning the surroundings, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, her senses heightened as if she were listening for something. Ethan could feel it too. There was something wrong in the air. It was as if the very forest had grown silent, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Without warning, the ground beneath their feet vibrated again, this time stronger than before. Ethan stumbled, barely catching himself on a nearby tree. The alien didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the horizon, where the dense trees met the night sky. She was waiting, anticipating something that Ethan couldn't see yet. He swallowed hard, fear gnawing at his stomach. What was out there? The alien's expression hardened, her golden eyes flaring briefly. Her voice was low, almost a growl, as she spoke. They're here. Before Ethan could ask who, he felt it. A shift in the air, a sudden pressure, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on them. And then he saw them, more of the creatures, emerging from the shadows, their monstrous forms barely visible in the dim light. This time, there were more than one. They were massive, their eyes glowing a sickly yellow, their forms hulking and menacing as they moved silently toward them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more, emerging from the darkness like predators on a hunt. And they weren't just coming for the alien. They were coming for him too. The alien stepped in front of him again, her body a shield, her stance unwavering. She was ready to fight. But this time, there was a different energy in the air. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was protecting something more than herself. Ethan could feel the change, the weight of her determination settling into his chest. Get behind me, she ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. There was no room for hesitation, no time for questions. She wasn't asking. She was telling him what to do. Ethan didn't argue. He moved quickly, stepping behind her, trying to steady his breathing as the creatures drew closer. His mind raced. He had no idea what these things were, but they were clearly not friendly. They were relentless, their eyes fixed on the alien, and he realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't just hunting her. They were hunting her to the death. The alien raised her hand again, her wrist device flashing a brilliant light. It was as though the very air around them, charged with energy, swirling and humming with an intensity that made Ethan's skin tingle. The creatures hesitated for a moment, their growls echoing through the trees, before they closed in. They were faster than Ethan expected, their movements fluid and terrifyingly quick. One of them lunged, its claws outstretched toward the alien. But she was ready. With a swift motion, she raised both hands, her fingers glowing with that same brilliant energy, and the creature was sent flying backward, crashing into a tree with a deafening thud. Ethan felt the shockwave from the impact, but the alien didn't flinch. She moved like a force of nature, like she was made to destroy, to defend, without hesitation. Another creature charged, and the alien met it head-on, her body a blur of movement. She twisted, her wrist device glowing brightly as she struck. A wave of energy radiated from her, knocking the creature off its feet, sending it sprawling to the ground. She didn't stop there. She moved in an instant, her energy flaring as she unleashed another blast, her power crackling in the air. The creature howled in pain before it vanished into the darkness. Ethan was frozen, his eyes wide as he watched her fight. He had never seen anything like this. She was more powerful than he could have imagined, and every move she made sent shockwaves of energy rippling through the air. But he couldn't help but notice something strange in her movements. There was a fury in her actions, a desperation in the way she fought. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just about protecting him. It was something deeper, something that drove her to fight with everything she had. The creatures weren't backing down. They were relentless, coordinated, their attacks coming faster and faster. Ethan could hear their growls growing louder, their hunger for the alien unmistakable. He could see it now. These creatures were more than just predators. They were part of something larger, something that had been hunting the alien for longer than he could comprehend. In that moment, Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't just about survival. The alien was fighting for something more. She was fighting to protect the last remnants of her race, her legacy. But these creatures weren't just a threat. They were the last obstacle standing in her way. And if they didn't stop them, the alien's obsession with survival, and with him, would be the end of them both. The alien's gaze flicked to Ethan for a brief moment. Her eyes were fierce, filled with the kind of determination that only came from years of survival. Her obsession with him, with protecting him, was no longer just about fate. It was about something more, something deeper. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice fierce and unyielding. And just like that, Ethan understood. The danger was far from over. And this fight was just beginning. The ultimate choice. The creatures were relentless. Even after several of their own had fallen, the remaining ones pressed forward with an unyielding drive. Each time the alien unleashed her power, sending blasts of radiant energy into the air. Ethan could feel the pulse of the battlefield. The air was thick with tension, charged with the hum of the alien's power and the growls of the creatures closing in on them. He couldn't look away from the alien, who moved with a terrifying grace. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, her every move calculated, her focus unwavering. But as the battle wore on, Ethan began to notice something. The alien was growing more and more exhausted. Her movements became less fluid, her energy less frequent. It wasn't that her power was fading. It was that her mind, her heart, was being stretched thin. There was something she was holding back. It was as though she was fighting not just to survive, but to protect something far deeper within herself. Ethan couldn't understand it, but he could feel it in the air. There was a desperation in her strikes, a frantic need to finish this, to end it all. As one of the creatures lunged at her from the shadows, Ethan reacted instinctively. He stepped forward, grabbing a nearby branch and swinging it with all his strength at the creature's back. The creature roared, momentarily distracted, but the alien was there in a heartbeat. She swept the creature away with a burst of energy, knocking it back several yards. For the first time, she glanced at Ethan, and the look in her eyes was a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that made his chest tighten. "You shouldn't be here," she said through gritted teeth, her voice harsh from the strain of the battle. "This is my fight. I cannot let them take you." Ethan's heart raced as he processed her words. She was still protecting him, despite everything. Despite her obsession with survival, despite the overwhelming threat from the creatures, she was still focused on him. Her gaze was fierce, but there was something else lurking in her eyes. Something vulnerable. Something he had seen before. The quiet ache of a survivor who had lost everything. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan said, his voice firm, though his heart felt as if it was pounding in his throat. You're not alone in this. We can fight them together. The alien's eyes softened for a brief moment, and Ethan saw something he hadn't expected, an almost imperceptible flicker of relief. But it was gone in an instant as the next creature charged. Without hesitation, the alien raised her hand, her energy surging as she blasted the creature back, sending it tumbling into the trees with a deafening roar. But this time, there was no triumph in her eyes, only exhaustion. Ethan could see it now. This wasn't just a battle for survival. The alien was trying to protect something far more than herself. She was fighting for the last shred of her kind, fighting to ensure that whatever had been lost could somehow be found again. But there was something else, something that had started to grow between them. He couldn't deny it anymore. The pull, the connection. It wasn't just fate. It wasn't just about her needing him for survival. She was obsessed with him, yes, but there was something deeper, something tied to the very core of who she was. He stepped forward again, this time standing by her side. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said, his voice steady. "Tell me how to help." For a moment, the alien didn't answer. She turned toward him, her golden eyes searching his face, as if trying to see past the surface, trying to understand the bond they shared. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice low but filled with emotion. "I need you to choose," she said, her words heavy with the weight of the moment. "You must choose, Ethan. You must choose to stand by me or let me face this alone. My survival, my future, everything that I am, depends on it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on him. This wasn't just about fighting these creatures. It wasn't just about staying alive. This was about something bigger. The alien's survival depended on him, and the weight of that responsibility was more than he had ever imagined. But then it hit him. This wasn't just her fight. It was his fight too. The bond between them had grown stronger than he had realized, and whatever future she was fighting for, whatever her legacy was, he couldn't walk away from it. He couldn't abandon her now. "I choose you," Ethan said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm with you. Whatever comes next, I'll face it with you." The alien didn't say anything at first. Her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Ethan could see something in her gaze, something that made his heart ache. She was terrified. Terrified not just for her own survival, but for the future, for what they could become. The weight of her choices was crushing, and yet she had no choice but to continue, to fight, to survive. And now he was part of that fight, part of her future. The alien stepped forward, her body pressed close to his. She didn't speak, but her hand brushed against his, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. In that touch, Ethan felt it, the bond, the connection that had been growing between them since the moment they had met. It was stronger now, more real than ever before. And as the creatures circled around them, sensing their unity, the air seemed to hum with a new energy. Together, they were unstoppable. Ethan and the alien stood side by side, their bodies a united front against the creatures closing in. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But now, for the first time, Ethan understood. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing something greater than themselves. It was about choosing each other. Unbreakable bond. The creatures circled them, their growls growing louder as the air thickened with impending doom. Ethan stood side by side with the alien, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no going back now. The alien had revealed everything, her struggle to survive, her need to rebuild, her obsession with him. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the bond they shared, a bond that had been forged in the fire of danger, of survival, and of choice. Ethan glanced at the alien, her golden eyes still glowing in the moonlight. Despite the chaos around them, there was a stillness in her, a quiet resolve that made his heart swell with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. She wasn't just fighting to stay alive anymore. She was fighting for the future, for something greater than herself. And now he was a part of that. The weight of the decision he had made, to stand by her and fight, felt like a promise, one that he couldn't break, no matter what came next. As the creatures growled and snarled, Ethan gripped a nearby branch tighter, his knuckles white. He wasn't the soldier she was. He wasn't a warrior. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let her face this alone. Not now. Not ever. The connection between them was too strong, too real. The alien raised her hand again, her fingers glowing with energy. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't just power. It was a surge of emotion, an overwhelming force that radiated from her and wrapped around him like a protective shield. The creatures took another step forward, but the alien didn't flinch. She stood tall, her energy now pulsing with a purpose that went beyond survival. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now, the pull between them, the energy that flowed between their hearts, intertwining their fates. It was something more than just a need to survive. It was something deeper, something unbreakable. He knew, in that moment, that whatever came next, they would face it together. They were no longer just two beings fighting for their lives. They were a force to be reckoned with. The alien spoke then, her voice calm, almost serene, despite the chaos surrounding them. "This is the moment," she said, her gaze steady, locking with Ethan's. "This is where we either survive or we perish, together." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He could feel the intensity of her words, the weight of them. They were both at a crossroads, both standing on the edge of something that would change everything. There was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. The first of the creatures lunged forward, but the alien reacted in a blur of motion, her hand outstretched. A wave of energy burst from her, bright and blinding, knocking the creature back with enough force to send it crashing into a tree. It didn't stop. Another one took its place, charging at them with a speed that left Ethan barely enough time to react. But this time, it wasn't just the alien's power that struck back. Ethan, feeling the unbreakable bond between them, stepped forward. He swung the branch with all his might, catching the creature in the side. The force of the blow staggered it, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The creature growled and lunged again. But before it could reach him, the alien was there. She moved so fast, so fluidly, that Ethan could barely follow her. Her energy surged again, this time wrapping around the creature in a powerful, unyielding grip. The creature howled in pain as it was lifted off the ground, its claws scratching uselessly at the air. The alien's energy constricted around it, and with one final, decisive motion, she sent it crashing to the ground, lifeless. Ethan's heart raced as he stood in the aftermath of the battle. The remaining creatures hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something more, something far more powerful. The bond between Ethan and the alien had become their greatest weapon, and the creatures knew it. For a moment, there was silence. The creatures, sensing their defeat, began to retreat into the shadows. The alien's energy pulsed once more, but this time, it wasn't an attack. It was a declaration. They had won. Together. The creatures had been defeated, but more than that, Ethan and the alien had emerged stronger than they had ever been before. Their bond had become unbreakable. The alien turned to him, her eyes still glowing, but now, there was a softness to them, an emotion that transcended their shared struggle. She stepped closer, and for the first time, Ethan saw the full extent of the vulnerability that had been hiding behind her fierce determination. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with sincerity. "You chose to stand by me. You chose to fight for me. And now we have a future I thought was lost." Ethan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. The words didn't come easily. He didn't need to say anything. Everything that had been left unspoken between them, everything they had shared in the heat of battle, was enough. For the first time since meeting her, Ethan understood. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about building something new, together. The alien smiled, her eyes glowing with a warmth he hadn't seen before. "The journey isn't over," she said, her voice steady with hope. "But we've made it this far. And as long as we're together, there's nothing we can't overcome." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't expected: hope. Hope for a future that seemed impossible only days before. The world around them was vast and uncertain, but one thing was clear: they had each other. And that was all that mattered. As they stood there, side by side, the night seemed less dark. The future was still unknown, but with their bond stronger than ever, Ethan knew that together they would face whatever came next. The fight had just begun, but now they were ready.